The rain had no mercy that night. It fell in sheets so thick that the torches along the village road drowned one by one, swallowed by the dark. I remember standing at the edge of the forest path, my gray cloak soaked through to the skin, my braid heavy against my back like a rope pulling me downward. I should have gone home. Every reasonable thought I had told me to turn around, to leave the mud and the storm behind, and find the warmth of the small healer's cottage I called my own. But there was something on the road. At first I thought it was an animal, the shape of it too large, too still, collapsed against the roots of an ancient oak that bordered the King's Road. I took 3 steps closer, and the lightning split the sky open above me. In that white flash, I saw him. A man, or something close to one. He was enormous, even crumpled as he was against the ground. Broad shoulders draped in a fur mantle that had gone black with rain, leather armor strapped across his chest with buckled belts now caked in mud. His dark braids spread around him like roots of their own, tangled with leaves. One arm was stretched outward, as though reaching for something he had already lost. His face, sharp jaw, heavy brow, a short dark beard, was turned to the side, cheek against the earth. I did not recognize him. How could I? I was Molly of Ashfin, a village healer's apprentice at the edge of the Ironwood territory. Kings and their faces lived in rumors, not in roads outside my village. I knelt beside him anyway. His pulse was there, faint, but there, beneath my fingers when I pressed them to his throat. His skin burned despite the cold rain. Fever, or something else. A wound along his left side, beneath the leather, was the source of it. I could tell by the way his breath hitched when the rain shifted, and the weight of his mantle pressed against it. "You cannot move a man this size alone," said every practical voice inside me. I moved him anyway. It took the better part of an hour. I used what I had. The length of rope I carried for gathering bundles of herbs, a fallen branch as a lever, and the sheer stubbornness that my mother always said was my worst quality and my only useful one. I dragged him, inch by inch, off the open road and beneath the wide canopy of the oak's lower branches, where the rain thinned. I packed the wound with the yarrow I kept folded in oilcloth inside my satchel, bound it with strips torn from the dry lining of my cloak. I covered him with what remained of the cloak itself. By the time I sat back on my heels, I was shaking. Not from cold, though the cold was real, but from the particular exhaustion of doing something that had demanded everything from you. He stirred. Not much. Just a sound. Low, rough, almost animal. And the hand that had been reaching outward curled slowly inward, fingers closing against the earth. His eyes did not open, but he was breathing easier. I could hear it, even through the rain. I stayed until the worst of the storm passed. I told myself it was only to ensure the binding held. I told myself any healer would do the same. I boiled water in the small copper pot I had with me, using flint and the dry bark I carried in my satchel, and coaxed a little of the herb-steeped liquid past his lips when he shifted close enough to something like consciousness. He swallowed without waking. His fever was still high, but it had not climbed further. That was something. Dawn was turning the sky the color of pale ash when I finally stood. I looked at him once more. This stranger in the mud, this man whose armor and bearing spoke of someone far above a village road. And I thought, whoever you are, you will live. It was not a wish. It was simply what I knew. I had learned to read the body's quiet language before I learned to read letters. And this man's body was choosing to stay. I left before he could wake. I did not think about it as I walked back through the thinning rain toward Ashfen. I thought about the herbs I would need to restock, about the widow Berta whose cough had worsened, about whether the market near the southern gate would open despite the mud. Ordinary things. The kind of things that kept a woman like me properly inside the borders of her own life. I was almost back to the village when I heard the hoofbeats. 6 horses. Heavy war horses, not the light mounts of merchants or messengers. They came from the eastern road, the direction of Ironwood Castle, and they moved with the urgency of men who had been riding through the night. The riders wore armor dark as charcoal, with the iron wolf crest of the Lycan kingdom pressed into their breastplates. Royal guards. I stepped to the side of the road and kept my eyes down the way every Omega in the realm had been taught to do when ranked wolves passed. Make yourself small, make yourself invisible, do not invite notice. They did not stop for me. But as the last rider passed, he pulled his reins and turned his horse in a half-circle, looking back down the road with an expression of controlled panic that cut through his trained composure. He was searching for something, for someone. And then he looked at me. "You," he said. His voice was clipped, authoritative, beta, by the weight of his posture. "Have you seen anyone on this road tonight? A large man, dark braids, black armor?" My hands were still in front of me, fingers laced, the way I held them when I wanted to appear calm. Beneath my nails, I noticed for the first time, there was still dried mud. The specific mud of the place where I had dragged him. "The road was empty when I passed," I said. Which was true. It was empty now. I had made certain of it. The guard stared at me for a long moment. His nostrils flared, a subtle thing, the way a wolf tests the air, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not suspicion. Something more complicated than that. He turned his horse without another word and rode to join the others. I exhaled slowly and continued walking. I did not let myself wonder why I had not told him. I did not let myself examine the feeling that had seized me when he asked. A fierce, irrational closing off, like a hand covering a flame against the wind. It meant nothing. I had simply answered what was true. The road had been empty. The village of Ashfen woke slowly around me as I passed through the gate. Smoke rising from cook fires, the sound of a hammer beginning in the smithy, children driving geese toward the common green. The world utterly ordinary. I greeted the gatekeeper with a nod and made my way to the healer's cottage, where I changed my wet things, rebuilt the fire, and began measuring dried herbs into their proper jars with steady hands. Steady hands. That was all I had ever needed. By mid-morning, the news had reached even Ashfen. It came in the way news always came to border villages, through a traveling merchant who had heard it from a guard who had heard it at a way station. Breathless, half-garbled, but unmistakable in its shape. The Lycan king had gone missing from his hunting party in the storm. King Caius, the Alpha King himself, had not returned to Ironwood Castle with his men. I was grinding a dried root when the merchant said the name in the square outside the open window. The grinding stone stopped in my hand. Caius, the large man, the dark braids, the blue eyes I had only seen closed, framed by rain-soaked lashes. I had packed a wound in boiled water and covered the Lycan king with my cloak. I sat down on the stool behind my work table and held that knowledge the way you hold something hot, carefully, with the understanding that it could burn you. By afternoon, the guards had circled back through Ashfen. By evening, a messenger bearing the iron wolf seal had arrived at the village elder's door. I heard the horns from the castle road, distant but unmistakable, and I knew that they had found him. He had lived. As I said he would. I told myself that was enough. That a woman like me, Omega-born, village-raised, with herb-stained hands and a borrowed cottage, had no business in whatever came next. I tended to widow Berta's cough. I reorganized the medicine shelf. I let the fire burn low and listened to the rain begin again. Softer this time, without the violence of the night before, and I tried very hard not to think about what it had felt like in that brief, unguarded moment. to hold the pulse of the most powerful man in the realm beneath my fingers and feel it strengthen. 3 days passed before the summons came. I had almost convinced myself it would not. Almost. There is a particular kind of hope that a woman in my position learns to distrust early, the kind that whispers perhaps this time will be different, and then watches you flinch when the world proves it right to doubt. I had packed that hope away like a winter garment stored in summer. I did not need it. I had my herbs, my cottage, my work. Then the royal messenger arrived at my door. He was young, barely past his first years of service, I guessed, by the way he held the sealed parchment with both hands as though it might escape him. The iron wolf crest pressed into dark wax. My name written on the outside in a hand I did not recognize, deliberate and heavy. Molly of Ashfen, by command of the crown. I read it twice, standing in the doorway, while the morning mist still clung to the thatch above my head. The messenger waited with the particular stillness of someone trained not to show impatience. Inside, the instruction was simple. I was to present myself at Ironwood Castle before the next bell. A guard escort waited at the village gate. I changed into my cleanest dress, plain linen, the color of undyed wool, and fastened my gray cloak at the throat. I rebraided my hair with steady hands, pulling the long golden plait over one shoulder. I took my satchel, not because anyone had asked me to, but because carrying it made me feel less like a woman being summoned and more like one arriving with a purpose. The ride to Ironwood Castle took less than half a morning. I had seen its towers from the high ridge above Ashfen on clear days, stone spires that cut the sky like dark teeth, but I had never been close enough to feel the weight of the place. As we crossed the bridge over the frozen river and passed beneath the Iron Wolf Gate, I understood for the first time why the kingdom was named as it was. The castle did not welcome. It simply stood, immovable and indifferent, and let you feel how small you were in comparison. The great hall smelled of pine resin and cold stone. Tapestries bearing the wolf crest in deep crimson and iron black hung from the vaulted ceiling. Guards lined the walls, betas, their posture rigid, their eyes forward. A fire burned in the central hearth large enough to stand inside. And at the far end of the hall, before the carved oak table where maps and sealed documents lay spread, stood Caius. He was nothing like the man I had left in the mud. He stood straight, extraordinarily straight, the way men stand when standing is itself an assertion of power. The dark braids were clean and ordered now, pulled back from a face that was composed, unreadable. He wore the same leather armor I recognized from that night, but cleaned and buckled into sharp precision. The black fur mantle settled over his shoulders like a second skin. His arms were crossed over his chest. His eyes, that particular unsettling shade of blue, deep as winter water, were already on me when I entered the room. I stopped 3 feet past the threshold. Beside him stood 2 men I had not expected. The beta guard who had questioned me on the road. I recognized the sharp line of his jaw. And an older man in robes of dark green, a Gamma advisor by the silver thread at his collar. Both of them looked at me with different kinds of assessment. The guard with something bordering on suspicion, the advisor with careful, measured curiosity. It was Caius who spoke first. "You are the healer." It was not a question. His voice was exactly as I might have imagined it, low, deliberate, each word placed with the precision of someone who had learned that his words carried consequence. There was something else beneath it, though. Something that surprised me. It was not the blunt command I expected. It was almost careful. "I am an apprentice healer, my Lord King," I said. My own voice came out steadier than I felt. "I have not yet completed my full training." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. Nothing so readable as that. A slight easing at the corner of his mouth, perhaps. Gone before I could be certain. "You bound a wound in a rainstorm with roadside yarrow and rope," he said. and my physician tells me the binding likely prevented a serious turn of fever. You are a healer. The Beta Guard, I would learn his name was Edric, captain of the Royal Guard, cleared his throat. Your Majesty. The girl also withheld her knowledge of your location from my men when questioned. The blue eyes did not move from me. I am aware. Then perhaps... I said I am aware, Edric. The silence that followed had weight. Edric went still. The advisor studied his own folded hands. I kept my gaze on Caius and tried to look like a woman who had not, in fact, spent 3 nights quietly afraid of exactly this moment. Why did you not tell them? Caius asked me. I considered the honest answer, which was complicated, and gave him the truest version of it I could. You were not in danger from the storm any longer, I said, and I did not know who wanted you found, or why. A long pause. You did not recognize me. No, my Lord King. And when you did, after the news reached your village, you still said nothing. You were already found by then, I said. There was nothing left to say. He studied me for what felt like a very long time. In that silence, I became acutely aware of how I must appear. A young Omega woman in undyed linen, smelling of dried herbs and wood smoke, standing in the great hall of Ironwood Castle before the AlphaKing and his council. Entirely out of place. Entirely without rank or armor or anything to recommend me, except, apparently, the fact that I had once made a decent field dressing in the rain. What do you want? He asked. I blinked. The question caught me off balance, not because it was strange, but because it was real. No ceremony around it, no lead-up, just the question, plain and direct, as though he genuinely wanted to know. I want to return to Ashvin, I said honestly. I have a patient with a persistent cough and a shelf of medicines to restock before the first frost. Edric made a sound that might have been disbelief. The advisor, I would later learn he was called Lord Brennan, the king's senior counsel, looked up from his hands with both eyebrows raised. Caius said nothing for a moment, and then, quietly, You saved my life, and your first request is to leave. I did not save your life, my Lord King. I stabilized a wound. Your life was never truly in my hands, only the next several hours of it. I paused. I am glad those hours went well. It was more words than I had intended to say. I pressed my lips together and waited. He uncrossed his arms. It was a small movement, but in a man like him, it read like something larger. A subtle shift in the architecture of his posture, some tension releasing that I had not noticed, was there. You will be compensated, he said. Lord Brennan will see to it. I nodded. That was that then. I would take what was offered, though I had not come for it, and return to the ordinary shape of my life. I was turning to go when his voice came again, quieter than before. Molly of Ashvin. I turned back. He was still watching me. That same unreadable expression, except, and perhaps I imagined this, something behind it that was not quite as settled as the rest of him. Some small disturbance in the winter water blue of his eyes. The binding you used, he said. The angle of it. My physician said it was an unusual technique for a village apprentice. My teacher was particular about pressure distribution, I said carefully. He nodded once, slowly, as if the answer had told him something beyond the words. I left the great hall with a small purse of silver coin that Lord Brennan pressed into my hands at the door, and the persistent, unsettling feeling of blue eyes following me across stone floors long after I had stopped being able to see them. On the road back to Ashvin, the escort riding a respectful distance behind me, I made myself a firm and reasonable promise. I would not think about Ironwood Castle again. I would not think about the great hall, or the fire in the hearth, or the way a king had asked, "What do you want?" as though the answer genuinely mattered to him. I would go home. I would tend to widow Berta. I would restock the medicine shelf. And I would not think about blue eyes. I thought about blue eyes the entire way home. 2 weeks after I returned to Ashvin, the village elder called a gathering at the common hall. I almost did not go. The fire in my cottage was warm. Widow Berta had finally stopped coughing through the night. And I had a fresh batch of elderberry tonic cooling in clay pots along the windowsill. The comfortable smallness of my life had begun to settle back around me like a familiar shawl, and I had learned, more than once, that gatherings called by elders rarely brought news that improved the lives of Omegas in border villages. But I went, because not going felt too much like being afraid, and I refused to be afraid of news. The common hall was full. The elder, a stout beta named Godwin with a gray beard down to his belt, stood at the head of the room with the expression of a man carrying something heavier than he would like. Around him clustered the village's small council, the blacksmith, the miller, the 2 senior hunters who served as Ashfen's informal wardens. Behind them, packed shoulder to shoulder in the amber torchlight, were the faces I had known my whole life. Farmers, weavers, mothers with children pressed against their sides. And at the back of the room, leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed and his guard's posture unmistakable even out of full armor, was Edric. My stomach tightened. Godwin cleared his throat. "Word has come from Ironwood Castle," he said, in the manner of a man who had rehearsed his calm. "The King's Council has issued a formal announcement. King Caius is to be wed before the winter solstice." The room absorbed this, the way rooms absorb large stones dropped into still water. A moment of silence, then ripples spreading outward in the form of murmurs, whispers. A child asking her mother a question that was quickly hushed. I stood very still near the back, beside the herb seller's wife, and kept my expression exactly neutral. "The chosen bride," Godwin continued, unrolling the parchment in his hands, "is Lady Seraphine of House Valdrin. The betrothal was arranged by the King's Council, with the blessing of the noble houses of the Eastern Territories." More murmurs. Lady Seraphine of House Valdrin was a name even border villages knew. The eldest daughter of the most powerful alpha noble house in the kingdom, known for her beauty, her political connections, and a disposition that those who had served in the Eastern courts described carefully as formidable. I told myself the tightening in my chest was simply the close air of a crowded hall. I told myself that on the walk home, too. And while I poured myself a cup of cooled tonic and sat by the dying fire, and while I lay awake listening to the wind work its way through the gaps in the cottage walls, it was nothing. Of course it was nothing. I had spoken to the man twice. He had paid me in silver and sent me home. The betrothal was a matter for nobles and councils, for houses and alliances and the architecture of power that had never once included a woman like me in its design. I fell asleep telling myself this, and woke the next morning with the same words still running quietly beneath everything else, like water under ice. Edric came to my door 3 days later. He arrived alone this time, without the formality of a royal messenger or a written summons. He knocked. Actually knocked, which surprised me. I had expected the kind of man who simply opened doors, and waited on the step with his hands clasped behind his back. Out of his guard armor, he wore a plain traveling tunic of dark wool, which made him look only marginally less like a man who could end a conversation with his fists. "The king requests your presence at the castle," he said when I opened the door. "The king has a physician," I said. "The king's physician is 63 years old and believes in bleeding as a primary treatment." A pause. "The wound has shown signs of renewed irritation. Your field binding held, but the underlying tissue needs attention that old Perrin is not, in the captain's personal assessment, best suited to provide." I studied Edric for a moment. His face was controlled, but not unkind. There was a quality to him that I was beginning to recognize. A man who served with his whole self and had long since made his peace with what that required. Why did he not simply send for a senior healer from the city? I asked. He did not ask for a senior healer from the city, Edric said, with the careful neutrality of a man choosing his words like footholds on uncertain ground. He asked for you. I packed my satchel in silence and followed him to the horses. The castle felt different the second time. Not smaller. It would never feel small, but less foreign. I noticed details I had been too unsteady to register before. The carved wolf heads on the gateposts, worn smooth at the ears by years of hands passing close. The way the inner courtyard smelled of hay and iron and wood smoke. The stable hands who moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had found dignity in their work. Edric led me not to the great hall but through a side corridor, past the kitchens where the smell of baking bread briefly softened everything, and up a narrow stair to the upper keep. The king's private study was nothing like I expected. It was large but not grand. Shelves of maps and bound manuscripts covered 3 walls, and the 4th held a window overlooking the castle's inner yard, its leaded glass casting the afternoon light into pale squares across the stone floor. A work table dominated the center of the room, spread with more maps, sealed documents, a half-eaten heel of bread that someone had set down and forgotten. It was the room of a man who lived inside his work, and the work was everywhere. Caius stood at the window with his back to the door when we entered. He turned when he heard us, and I noticed immediately that he moved more carefully than he had in the great hall, a slight guard in his left side. The wound. "Leave us," he said to Edric. Edric looked at me once. Not warning, not apology, something that might have been the faintest acknowledgement that this was unusual, and withdrew, pulling the door closed. We were alone. "Sit," Caius said, gesturing to the chair beside the work table. He did not say please, but neither did the word land like a command. It landed like something in between, a man accustomed to authority, making a small effort against it. I sat. I set my satchel on the table and opened it. "Will you remove the outer layer of the armor so I can see the binding?" I asked. He crossed to the chair opposite and began unbuckling the leather straps with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had dressed and undressed his own wounds many times before. I focused on laying out my materials: fresh yarrow, clean linen strips, a small pot of the drawing salve I had prepared before leaving Ashvin, half certain I would need it. When I leaned forward to examine the wound, the first thing I thought was that old Perrin had made a reasonable attempt at redressing it. The second thing I thought was that he had used entirely the wrong kind of wrap for tissue that needed to breathe. No wonder it had irritated. I worked quietly. Caius sat with the particular stillness of someone who had decided to tolerate a necessary thing without complaint. He was not a patient man by nature. I could feel that in the controlled tension of his breathing, the way his hands stayed flat against his thighs by deliberate choice. But he held still. "The betrothal announcement reached Ashven," I said. I did not know why I said it. I had not planned to. A beat of silence. "News travels quickly to border villages." "It always has." I smoothed the new binding into place. "Lady Seraphine is well regarded. She is politically advantageous," he said. There was no warmth in it. No coldness either. Simply the flat weight of a fact, stated by a man who had made his peace with facts. I looked up at him. He was watching me with that same focused attention he had turned on me in the great hall, like I was a map he was attempting to read, and the legend had been written in a language he was still learning. "Is it not what you wanted?" I asked. Too direct, perhaps. But something in the room, the intimacy of the work, the smallness of the space, the bread left half-eaten on the table, had stripped away the careful layers of deference I usually wore in the presence of power. He was quiet for a long moment. "What I want," he said at last, quietly, "has rarely been the question put before me." I tied off the final knot in the binding and sat back. Outside the window, The inner courtyard carried on its ordinary business. The clang of the smithy, the call of a guard on the wall walk, a raven lifting from the gatehouse into the pale afternoon sky. I began replacing my materials in the satchel, each motion deliberate, giving myself something to do with my hands, while the words he had just spoken settled into the room like sediment into still water. He was watching me still when I finally stood. "You should rest the left side for at least 4 days," I said, "and tell old Paran to use linen that breathes." The corner of his mouth shifted, that same almost thing that was not quite a smile. "I will pass that along." I picked up my satchel. Molly. Just my name. No title around it, no formal address. Just the word, spoken in that low, deliberate voice, and I felt it land somewhere in the center of my chest with a weight entirely disproportionate to its size. I turned. "Will you come again?" he asked. "In 4 days. To check the binding." The correct answer, the sensible answer, the answer a woman with any reasonable understanding of her own position in the world would give, was no. He had a physician. He had a counsel. He had a betrothed from a powerful noble house. He had an entire kingdom designed to ensure that a woman like me remained precisely where she belonged, which was not here. "Yes," I said, and I left before I could take it back. 4 days became 8. 8 became 3 weeks. I told myself each visit was the last. I told myself this with great conviction on the road to Ironwood Castle. And then I arrived. And Edric would meet me at the gate with the same expression of carefully managed neutrality, and the corridor through the kitchens would smell of bread and wood smoke, and I would climb the narrow stair to the study and find Caius exactly where I had come to expect him, bent over his maps, a half-eaten meal forgotten at the edge of the table, the raven he kept on a perch near the window watching me with one bright eye as I entered. The wound healed cleanly. It was healed in truth by the 2nd week. We both knew it. Neither of us said so. What we did instead was talk. Not the way a king and a village healer ought to talk, formal, bounded by rank and protocol, but the way 2 people talk when they have somehow, without intending to, begun to trust the particular texture of each other's silence. He asked about Ashvin, about the medicinal plants that grew in the Ironwood borderlands, and which ones I had found that the castle's own stores lacked. About the widow Berta, whose cough I mentioned once in passing, and whom he asked about with genuine, specific curiosity on every visit thereafter. I asked, carefully at first, and then less carefully, about the maps on his table. About the border dispute with the northern clans that kept him at the table past midnight. About the old law he was attempting to revise that governed Omega rights in the Eastern Territories. That last question made him look up from the map with something I had not yet seen clearly on his face, something unguarded. "You know about the Eastern Territories law," he said. "Every Omega in the kingdom knows about it," I said. "It is the reason Omega healers cannot hold independent practice licenses in 3 of the 5 territories. My teacher had to register her cottage under a beta's name for 20 years. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned back to the documents on the table. But his hand moved. I saw it, pulling a particular sheaf of parchment from beneath the others and setting it on top. He did not explain the gesture. I did not ask him to. These were the small things that accumulated between us like snowfall, individually weightless, collectively transforming the shape of everything beneath. And then Lady Seraphine arrived at Ironwood Castle. I knew it before anyone told me. I felt the change in the castle the moment I passed through the gate on my 4th week of visits. A different quality of tension in the guard's posture. A new formality in the way the servants moved through the corridors. Fresh banners had been hung in the great hall, deep crimson with the gold falcon crest of House Valdrin, crossing the iron wolf of the crown. The smell of the castle had changed too. Something floral and expensive threading through the pine resin and cold stone, foreign and deliberate. Edric met me in the inner courtyard. His expression was, for the first time, something other than neutral. "The Lady Seraphine arrived this morning," he said. Not quite a warning, not quite an apology. Something balanced uncomfortably between the two. "I gathered," I said. "Her presence will change the rhythm of certain things." He paused, choosing words with visible care. "The king's schedule is considerably less his own today." I adjusted the strap of my satchel. "Then perhaps today is not the right day for a visit." "He asked for you specifically," Edric said, "before her party arrived. He left word at the gate." I followed Edric up the narrow stair, but the study was not where we stopped. Instead, he led me to the Great Hall's antechamber, a smaller room off the main corridor, hung with older tapestries, smelling of beeswax candles and stone. Through the thick oak door, I could hear voices from the hall beyond. The formal cadence of introduction ceremonies, the measured responses of a council in attendance. I sat on the bench along the wall and waited. She entered the antechamber 20 minutes later. Lady Seraphine of House Valdrin was exactly what the rumors had promised, and entirely what I had braced myself for. Tall, dark-haired, with the composed bearing of a woman who had been trained since childhood to occupy rooms as though she had built them herself. Her gown was deep green velvet with gold thread at the cuffs and collar, and she wore her rank the way some women wear jewels, as something so naturally integrated into her appearance that removing it was unimaginable. She was perhaps 25, and beautiful in the manner of things that have been deliberately cultivated to be so. She stopped when she saw me. Her dark eyes moved over me with the particular efficiency of a woman accustomed to assessing situations quickly. The plain linen dress, the healer's satchel, the golden braid over one shoulder. She catalogued me in the space of 3 seconds, and whatever conclusion she reached settled into her expression as something close to careful interest. "You are the Omega healer from the border village," she said. "I am, my lady." "The one who found the king on the road?" It was not quite a question. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she crossed to the bench across from mine and sat with the fluid grace of long practice. Unexpectedly. A woman of her rank did not typically sit in anterooms with Omega Village healers. She seemed entirely unconcerned with this. "He speaks of you," she said. My hands stayed still in my lap. "I cannot imagine in what context, my lady." "In the context of the Eastern Territories revision," she said. "In the context of border village medical supply lines. In the context of—" She paused, and something shifted in her expression. Not unkind, but precisely honest. In the context of someone whose opinion he finds worth hearing. I did not know what to do with that, so I said nothing. Seraphine studied me with those dark, intelligent eyes. "I want you to understand something," she said, and her voice dropped slightly. Not to a whisper, but to the register of a woman speaking plainly, rather than formally. "This betrothal was arranged by the council. I am not without my own feelings on the matter, and I will not pretend otherwise to someone who appears to have little patience for pretense." A pause. "I did not come here expecting love. I came here because my house and this kingdom need what this union provides. I am pragmatic, if nothing else." "My lady," I said carefully, "I am only a healer." "You are only a healer," she agreed, with a faint, dry precision that surprised me, in the same way that the Ironwood River is only a trickle. Both statements are technically defensible and practically misleading. I looked at her for a moment. Underneath the cultivated composure, underneath the velvet and the bearing and the practiced grace, there was something I had not anticipated. A woman who was also, in her own entirely different way, navigating a life whose shape had been drawn by hands other than her own. We were interrupted by the door opening. Caius stood in the doorway. He looked between us. One long, still moment where his blue eyes moved from Seraphine to me and back again, with an expression I could not fully decode. Something careful in it. Something that held, along its edges, the particular tension of a man who has walked into a room and found two things he had kept separate now occupying the same space. "Molly," he said. Then, with slightly more formality, "My Lady Seraphine." Seraphine rose with perfect composure. "My Lord King, I was becoming acquainted with your healer." She glanced at me once more, that same precise, honest look, and then moved past him through the door with the unhurried grace of a woman who had decided, for reasons of her own, to give the room back to someone else. Caius waited until her footsteps faded down the corridor. Then he stepped inside and closed the door. "How long were you waiting?" he asked. "Not long." I stood. "The binding should be fully resolved now. I do not think you need me to confirm it again." He crossed the room in 3 steps and stopped closer than he usually did. Not improperly, but close enough that I could see the slight tension along his jaw, the careful control of a man managing something he had not yet found words for. "That is not why I asked you to come," he said quietly. "I know," I said. The candles in the antechamber burned very steadily. Outside, somewhere in the castle, a door opened and closed, and voices moved through the stone walls like water through channels, distant and unintelligible. "The council meets tomorrow," he said. "They will press for the formal betrothal announcement to the full court, a date before the solstice." I looked at him. "Then you should be ready for that meeting." "Molly, you are a king," I said, softly but clearly, not as a rebuke, as a fact that I needed us both to hold. "And I am a healer from a border village. Whatever this—" I gestured between us, a small motion that encompassed 3 weeks of maps and bread and blue eyes and words exchanged in the quiet of a study. "Whatever this is, it does not change what the council will decide, or what the kingdom needs." He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was very low. "And what do you need?" he asked. The question hit me in the same place his voice had landed when he said my name, somewhere central, somewhere undefended. I picked up my satchel. "I need to go home," I said, "and you need to go meet your court." I left him standing in the antechamber, surrounded by old tapestries and beeswax candlelight, and I did not look back, because I knew with the same certainty I brought to reading the body's quiet language, that if I looked back, I would not leave. Winter arrived at Ashvin the way it always did, without announcement, without courtesy. One morning the ground was cold earth, and the next it was frost, and by the end of the week, the river at the village's edge had taken on the gray stillness of something beginning to forget how to move. I built my fires higher and worked longer hours, because winter in a border village meant cracked skin and fever, and the particular despair that comes from cold that has no end in sight. And a healer's work expanded to fill every hour the season demanded. I was glad for it. Glad for the widow Berta, whose joints ached and who needed her warming tincture adjusted. Glad for the blacksmith's youngest, who had taken a winter chill and needed watching. Glad for the long pre-dawn hours when I ground dried herbs by firelight and thought about nothing except the work directly in front of my hands. I did not return to Ironwood Castle. 3 weeks passed, then 4. The winter solstice drew closer on the calendar that Godwin the Elder kept on the wall of the common hall, each day marked with a careful line. The date the council had chosen for the formal betrothal ceremony was 7 days before the solstice. Everyone in Ashvin knew it. It was the kind of news that settled over a kingdom like the season itself, simply, completely, without room for argument. I told myself I had made peace with it. I had not made peace with it. What I had done was build a careful wall between what I felt and what I allowed myself to act upon, and I tended that wall the way I tended my patients, with daily attention and the understanding that neglect would cost me more than the maintenance did. It was not happiness, but it was functional. It was the shape a life takes when you have decided that dignity matters more than wanting. It was on a Tuesday, gray sky, light snow beginning to fall in the late afternoon, that Edric appeared at my door for the third time. He looked different than he had on his previous visits. Not disheveled. Edric was constitutionally incapable of disheveled, but carrying something in his expression that had not been there before, a weight that sat differently than duty. "He needs you," he said, when I opened the door. "Not the healer. You." I looked at him for a long moment. "Edric." "I have served Caius since he was 17 years old," he said quietly. "I have watched him negotiate wars, hold councils together by sheer force of will, and carry the weight of a kingdom without flinching." He paused. "I have never watched him look at a map for an hour without seeing it until you came to this village." The snow fell softly between us. "The betrothal ceremony is in 4 days," I said. "I know." "Then what am I supposed to do with what you're telling me?" Edric was quiet for a moment. Then, "I am not telling you what to do. I am telling you what is true. What you do with truth has always been your particular gift, from what I have observed." He stepped back from the door. "The king is at the border outpost on the eastern ridge tonight, alone. He rides there sometimes, when the castle becomes too much." A pause. "It is 3 miles up the Ironwood Road. The snow is not yet deep enough to make it dangerous." He turned and walked back toward the horses without another word. I stood in my doorway for a long time. The snow continued to fall, patient and indifferent. Inside my cottage the fire crackled. On my workbench, the morning's herbs lay half-sorted, waiting. I put on my cloak. I banked the fire. And I walked to where my horse was stabled at the edge of the village. The border outpost was a small stone structure, more watchtower than shelter. Really, built into the ridge where the Ironwood Road crested and gave way to open sky in 3 directions. In summer, it offered a view that stretched to the distant mountains. In winter, it was a place that understood loneliness. He was there, standing outside the structure with his back against the stone wall, looking out across the valley where the snow was beginning to soften the hard edges of the world below. His dark braids were loose tonight, falling around his shoulders. No crown, no court armor, just the traveling leathers and the black fur mantle, and the particular stillness of a man who had come somewhere to be no one for a little while. He heard my horse before I reached him. He turned. I dismounted and tied the reins to the post and walked toward him through the falling snow. And I was aware, with every step, that I was crossing some invisible line I had drawn for myself, and was now simply walking past, deliberately, without pretending I did not see it. I stopped in front of him. For a moment neither of us spoke. The snow fell between us and around us, and the valley spread out below the ridge in great soft shapes, and the world was very quiet. "You should not have come," he said. "I know," I said. "The ceremony is in 4 days." "I know that too." He looked at me. That same reading a map expression, except that whatever he had been trying to find in me over these weeks, he seemed now to have found it, and the finding had not brought him the peace he might have hoped for. "Molly." My name in his mouth, low and careful. "Tell me to go back. Tell me to walk into that ceremony and fulfill what the council requires, and be the king the kingdom needs. Tell me, and I will do it. I have always done what was required." "I know you have," I said quietly. "Then tell me." I looked at him. This man who carried a kingdom in his posture and loneliness in his eyes, who had asked what do you want in a great hall as though the answer genuinely mattered, and had never once, in all the weeks that followed, stopped asking it in one form or another, who had pulled a sheaf of parchment from beneath his maps when I mentioned my teacher registering her cottage under Abeta's name, who forgot to eat the bread on his work table because the work consumed him, and who asked about Widow Berta's cough with genuine, specific care. "I cannot tell you that," I said, "because I do not know if it is what I believe." The silence stretched. Then he reached out, slowly, giving me every chance to step back, and took my hand. Just that. His hand around mine, warm against the cold, steady. "I am going to speak to the council," he said, "tomorrow, before the ceremony preparations are finalized. Caius, the Eastern Territories law revision is on the table," he said, "and the betrothal arrangement was drafted without a clause that accounts for changed circumstances." He looked at me with absolute directness. "I will not pretend to you that it will be simple. Seraphine's house is powerful. The council will resist. There will be a period of considerable difficulty." "I am an Omega healer from a border village," I said. "The court will accept what I decide," he said quietly, "when I make clear that I have decided." He paused. "If you decide the same." The snow was in his hair. The valley below had gone almost entirely white. Somewhere down the ridge, my horse shifted against the post and was still again. "This is not a small thing you are asking," I said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." I looked down at our joined hands. His, scarred, calloused, bearing the marks of a life that had demanded everything from him. Mine, herb-stained, capable. The hands of a woman who had learned that her worth lived in what she could do, not in what rank she had been born to. "Widow Berta needs her tincture adjusted through the winter," I said finally. "I cannot simply abandon my patients." Something moved through his expression. Something that was, unmistakably this time, the full version of that almost smile. Warm and real and entirely unguarded, lasting long enough to leave a mark. "We will send a properly licensed healer to Ashfin," he said, "one who does not need to register under another's name." I looked at him for a long moment. Then, "You should know that I have opinions about the border village supply lines." "I am aware," he said. "I am counting on it." What followed was not simple. He had told me it would not be, and he did not lie. The council meeting the next morning lasted 4 hours. Lord Brennan argued for the original arrangement with the careful, thorough logic of a man who had built a career on knowing where power lived. 2 of the senior nobles walked out and had to be recalled. A messenger was dispatched to House Valdrin before the ink on the revised terms was dry. And the response, when it came 3 days later, was colder than the winter outside. But Seraphine herself sent a separate message. Short, precise, written in her own hand on plain parchment. It read, "I told you I was pragmatic. House Valdrin's alliance can be secured through other means. I will hold you to seeing them secured. S." I read that letter twice and felt something settle in me that had not been fully settled before. A recognition of the woman I had met in the antechamber, who had sat across from me on a plain bench and spoken plainly, and who had, in her own way, chosen dignity over pretense as well. The formal court presentation happened on the winter solstice itself, under a sky so cold and clear it seemed made of glass. The great hall of Ironwood Castle was lit with 100 candles, and the lords and ladies of the kingdom assembled in their finest wool and furs watched a village healer in clean linen walk the length of the hall with her golden braid over one shoulder and her hands quiet at her sides. I did not make myself small. I had promised myself that. Caius stood at the far end of the hall, and when I reached him, he took both my hands in his and looked at me the way he had on the ridge in the snow, with the full, undefended weight of someone who has finally stopped managing what he feels and simply feels it. The council blessed the union, if not warmly, then at least without further resistance. Lord Brennan, to his credit, adapted to changed circumstances with the philosophical flexibility of a man who had served long enough to know that kings occasionally surprised him. Edric stood at the edge of the room with his arms crossed and his face entirely neutral, which I had come to understand was his version of profound satisfaction. Spring came late to Ashvin that year, but came fully when it arrived. Green and insistent, pushing through the last of the frost with the particular stubbornness of living things that have decided it is time. I rode out to the village on the first warm morning with a properly licensed healer beside me, a capable beta woman named Oswin, who had already memorized Widow Berta's case notes and had opinions of her own about elderberry tonic that I found genuinely interesting. We restocked the cottage together, reorganized the medicine shelf, and sat with Berta for an hour in the afternoon sun, while she told us, at considerable length, about the winter and her joints and the general unreliability of cold weather. On the ride back toward Ironwood Castle, I stopped at the crest of the ridge above Ashvin and looked back. The village lay below in the spring light, smoke from the cook fires, the sound of the smithy carrying faintly on the wind. Children in the common green, the shape of the life I had lived there, small and complete and mine. I held it the way you hold something you love that you are not losing, only changing the distance from. Then I turned my horse toward the castle. The Eastern Territories law revision passed the council chamber 6 weeks later. Omega healers could hold independent practice licenses in all 5 territories. My teacher's name went on the deed of her cottage before the month was out. She sent me a single line on plain parchment. I always knew you were more trouble than you appeared. I pinned it above the desk in the study I had been given, the one adjacent to Caius's, where I managed the kingdom's medical supply records and the border village correspondence. And occasionally, when he forgot to eat the bread on his work table, reminded him that healers had opinions about that too. He always listened. That was the thing about him that the rumors had never captured. Beneath the alpha authority, and the winter water eyes and the composure that could silence a room, he was, above everything else, a man who listened. We were married quietly at midsummer, in the castle's inner courtyard, with Edric as witness, and Lord Brennan officiating with the expression of a man who had decided that if something was inevitable, he might as well do it with grace. The raven from the study attended uninvited, and had to be removed from the ceremony twice. That evening, standing at the window of the study while the last of the summer light went gold across the courtyard below, I thought about the night on the road. The rain, the shape in the mud that I had walked toward instead of away from, for reasons I had not fully understood at the time. I understood them now. Not as grand fate or design. I was too much a healer for that kind of thinking, too accustomed to the body's practical logic, but as the particular kind of choice that defines a life. The choice to move toward rather than away, when every reasonable voice says the cost is too high and the outcome uncertain. Caius came to stand beside me. His hand found mine on the windowsill. "Widow Berta sent another letter," he said. "What does she want?" "To know if the new healer can be trusted." A pause. "She has a list of concerns about the elderberry tonic." She always has a list of concerns about the elderberry tonic. "She also wanted to know," he said, and I could hear the warmth in his voice, fully visible now. Nothing managing it, if the rumor is true. Which rumor? That the Omega healer who dragged the Lycan king out of the mud is now, and I am quoting Berta directly, running the whole kingdom from a desk full of herb records. I looked up at him. Those blue eyes, warm in the evening light, entirely unguarded. "Tell her," I said, "that the herb records are extremely well organized." He laughed. A real one, low and unguarded, and entirely his own. It filled the study the way warmth fills a room that has been cold a long time, reaching into the corners, changing the quality of the air. Outside, the courtyard settled into evening. Somewhere in the village below the castle road, a cook fire was lit. The raven returned to his perch without being asked. And in the end, that is what it was. Not a story of rank conquered or power seized, but of two people who had each spent a long time doing what was required, and who had chosen, when it finally mattered, to do something else. Something true. Something theirs.